Part 3 of Batwing by Sax Rohmer. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Batwing, Chapter 7. At the Lavender Arms. In certain moods, Paul Harley was impossible as a companion, and I, who knew him well, had learned to leave him to his own devices at such times. These moods invariably corresponded with his meeting some problem to the heart of which the lance of his keen wit failed to penetrate. His humor might not display itself in the spoken word; he merely became oblivious of everything and everybody around him. People might talk to him, and he scarce noted their presence. Familiar faces appear, and he would see them not. Outwardly, he remained the observant Harley, who could see further into a mystery than any other in England, but his observation was entirely introspective. Although he moved amid the hustle of life, he was spiritually alone, communing with the solitude which dwells in every man's heart. Presently, then, as we came to the lake at the foot of the sloping lawns, where water-lilies were growing and quite a number of swans had their habitation, I detected the fact that I had ceased to exist so far as Harley was concerned. Knowing this mood of old, I pursued my way alone, pressing on across the valley and making for a swing-gate which seemed to open upon a public footpath. Coming to this gate, I turned and looked back. Paul Harley was standing where I had left him by the edge of the lake, staring as if hypnotized at the slowly moving swans. But I would have been prepared to wager that he saw neither swans nor lake, but mentally was far from the spot, deep in some complex maze of reflection through which no ordinary mind could hope to follow him. I glanced at my watch and found that it was but little after 2 o'clock. Luncheon at Cray's Folly was early. I therefore had some time upon my hands, and I determined to employ it in exploring part of the neighbourhood. Accordingly, I filled and lighted my pipe and strolled leisurely along the footpath, enjoying the beauty of the afternoon and admiring the magnificent timber which grew upon the southerly slopes of the valley. Larks sang high above me, and the air was fragrant with those wonderful earthy scents which belong to an English countryside. A herd of very fine Jersey cattle presently claimed inspection, and a little farther on I found myself upon a high road, where a brown-faced fellow, seated aloft upon a hay-cart, cheerily gave me good day as I passed. Quite at random I turned to the left and followed the road, so that presently I found myself in a very small village, the principal building of which was a very small inn called the Lavender Arms. Colonel Menendez's curacao, combined with the heat of the day, had made me thirsty, for which reason I stepped into the bar-parlour determined to sample the local ale. I was served by the landlady, a neat, round, red little person, and as she retired, having placed a foam-capped mug upon the counter, her glance rested for a moment upon the only other occupant of the room, a man seated in an armchair immediately to the right of the door. A glass of whisky stood on the window-ledge at his elbow, and that it was by no means the first which he had imbibed his appearance seemed to indicate. Having tasted the cool contents of my mug, I leaned back against the counter and looked at this person curiously. He was apparently of about medium height, but of a somewhat fragile appearance. He was dressed like a country gentleman, and a stick and soft hat lay upon the ledge near his glass. But the thing about him which had immediately arrested my attention was his really extraordinary resemblance to Paul Harley's engraving of Edgar Allan Poe. I wondered at first if Harley's frequent references to the eccentric American genius, to whom he accorded a sort of hero-worship, were responsible for my imagining a close resemblance where only a slight one existed. But inspection of that strange dark face convinced me of the fact that my first impression had been a true one. Perhaps in my curiosity I stared rather rudely. "You will pardon me, sir," said the stranger, and I was startled to note that he spoke with a faint American accent. "But are you a literary man?" As I had judged to be the case, he was slightly bemused, but by no means drunk, and although his question was abrupt, it was spoken civilly enough. "Journalism is one of the several occupations in which I have failed," I replied lightly. "You are not a fiction writer?" "I lack the imagination necessary for that craft, sir." The other wagged his head slowly and took a drink of whiskey. "Nevertheless," he said, and raised his finger solemnly, "you were thinking that I resembled Edgar Allan Poe." "Good heavens!" I exclaimed, for the man had really amazed me. "You clearly resemble him in more ways than one. I must really ask you to inform me how you deduce such a fact from a mere glance of mine." "I will tell you, sir," he replied, "but first I must replenish my glass, and I should be honored if you would permit me to replenish yours." "Thanks very much," I said, "but I would rather you excused me." "As you wish, sir," replied the American with grave courtesy. "As you wish." He stepped up to the counter and rapped upon it with a half-crown, until the landlady reappeared. She treated me to a pathetic glance, but refilled the empty glass. My American acquaintance, having returned to his seat, and having added a very little water to the whiskey, went on. "Now, sir," he said, "my name is Colin Camber, formerly of Richmond, Virginia, United States of America, but now of the Guest House, Surrey, England, at your service." Taking my cue from Mr. Camber's gloomy but lofty manner, I bowed formally and mentioned my name. "I am delighted to make your acquaintance, Mr. Knox," he assured me. "And now, sir, to answer your question. When you came in a few moments ago, you glanced at me. Your eyes did not open widely, as is the case when one recognizes, or thinks one recognizes, an acquaintance. They narrowed. This indicated retrospection. For a moment they turned aside. You were focusing a fugitive idea, a memory. You captured it. You looked at me again, and your successive glances read as follows: the hair worn uncommonly long, the mathematical brow, the eyes of a poet, the slight moustache, the small mouth, weak chin, the glass at his elbow. The resemblance is complete. Knowing how complete it is myself, sir, I ventured to test my theory, and it proved to be sound." Now, as Mr. Colin Camber had thus spoken in the serious manner of a slightly drunken man, I had formed the opinion that I stood in the presence of a very singular character. Here was that seeming mesalliance which not infrequently begets genius, a powerful and original mind allied to a weak will. I wondered what Mr. Colin Camber's occupation might be, and somewhat, too, I wondered why his name was unfamiliar to me. For that the possessor of that brow and those eyes could fail to make his mark in any profession which he might take up, I was unwilling to believe. "Your exposition has been very interesting, Mr. Camber," I said. "You are a singularly close observer, I perceive." "Yes," he replied. "I have passed my life in observing the ways of my fellowmen, a study which I have pursued in various parts of the world, without appreciable benefit to myself. I refer to financial benefit." He contemplated me with a look which had grown suddenly pathetic. "I would not have you think, sir," he added, "that I am an habitual toper. I have latterly been upset by domestic worries, and he emptied his glass at a draught. "Surely, Mr. Knox, you are going to replenish. Whilst you are doing so, would you kindly request Mrs. Wooten to extend the same favour to myself?" But at that moment Mrs. Wooten in person appeared behind the counter. "Time, please, gentlemen," she said. "It is gone 2:30. "What!" exclaimed Mr. Camber, rising. "What is that? You decline to serve me, Mrs. Wooten?" "Why, not at all, Mr. Camber," answered the landlady. "But I can serve no one now. It's after time." "You decline to serve me," he muttered, his speech becoming slurred. "Am I then to be insulted?" I caught a glance of entreaty from the landlady. "My dear sir," I said, genially, "we must bow to the law, I suppose. At least, we are better off here than in America." "Ah, that is true," agreed Mr. Camber, throwing his head back and speaking the words as though they possessed some deep, dramatic significance. "Yes, but such laws are an insult to every intelligent man." He sat down again rather heavily, and I stood looking from him to the landlady, and wondering what I should do. The matter was decided for me, however, in a way which I could never have foreseen. For, hearing a light footfall upon the step which led to the bar-parlour, I turned, and there, almost beside me, stood a wrinkled little Chinaman. He wore a blue suit and a tweed cap. He wore queer, thick-soled slippers, and his face was like a smiling mask hewn out of very old ivory. I could scarcely credit the evidence of my senses, since the Lavender Arms was one of the last places in which I should have looked for a native of China. Mr. Colin Camber rose again, and fixing his melancholy eyes upon the newcomer. "Ah Tsung," he said in a tone of cold anger, "what are you doing here?" Quite unmoved, the Chinaman replied, "Ling yu chitsa, very soon go back." "What do you mean?" demanded Mr. Camber. "Answer me, Ha Tsung. Who sent you?" "Lily missy," crooned the Chinaman, smiling up into the other's face with a sort of childish entreaty. "Lily missy." "Oh," said Mr. Camber in a changed voice. "Oh." He stood very upright for a moment, his gaze set upon the wrinkled Chinese face. Then he looked at Mrs. Wooten and bowed, and looked at me and bowed, very stiffly. "I must excuse myself, sir," he announced. "My wife desires my presence at home." I returned his bow, and as he walked quite steadily toward the door, followed by Ah Tsong, he paused, turned, and said, "Mr. Knox, I should esteem it a friendly action if you would spare me an hour of your company before you leave Surrey. My visitors are few. Anyone will direct you to the guest-house. I am persuaded that we have much in common. Good day, sir." He went down the steps, disappearing in company with the Chinaman, and having watched them go, I turned to Mrs. Wooten, the landlady, in silent astonishment. She nodded her head and sighed. "The same every day and every evening for months past," she said. "I am afraid it's going to be the death of him." "Do you mean that Mr. Camber comes here every day and is always fetched by the Chinaman?" "Twice every day," corrected the landlady, "and his poor wife sends here regularly." "What a tragedy," I muttered, "and such a brilliant man." "Ah," said she, busily removing jugs and glasses from the counter, "it does seem a terrible thing." "Has Mr. Camber lived for long in this neighbourhood?" I ventured to inquire. "It was about 3 years ago, sir, that he took the old guest-house at Mid-Hatton. I remember the time well enough because of all the trouble there was about him bringing a Chinaman down here." "I can imagine it must have created something of a sensation," I murmured. "Is the guest-house a large property?" "Oh no, sir, only 10 rooms and a garden, and it had been vacant for a long time. It belongs to what is called the Crayland Park estate." "Mr. Camber, I take it, is a literary man?" "So I believe, sir." Mrs. Wooten, having cleared the counter, glanced up at the clock and then at me with a cheery but significant smile. "I see that it is after time," I said, returning the smile, "but the queer people who seem to live hereabouts interest me very much." "I can't wonder at that, sir," said the landlady, laughing outright. "Chinamen and Spanishmen and what not. If some of the old gentry that lived here before the war could see it, they wouldn't recognize the place, of that I'm sure." "Ah, well," said I, pausing at the step, "I shall hope to see more of Mr. Camber, and of yourself too, madam, for your ale is excellent." "Thank you, sir, I'm sure," said the landlady, much gratified. "But as to Mr. Camber, I really doubt if he would know you if you met him again. Not if he was sober, I mean." "Really?" "Oh, it's a fact, believe me. Just in the last 6 months or so he has started on the rampage like. But some of the people he has met in here and asked to call upon him have done it, thinking he meant it." "And they have not been well received," said I, lingering. "They have had the door shut in their faces," declared Mrs. Wooton with a certain indignation. "He either does not remember what he says or does when he is in drink, or he pretends he doesn't. Oh dear, it's a funny world. Well, good day, sir." "Good day," said I, and came out of the Lavender Arms full of sympathy with the views of the old gentry as outlined by Mrs. Wooton, for certainly it would seem that this quiet spot in the Surrey hills had become a rallying ground for peculiar people. Chapter 8. The Call of Macumbo. Of tea upon the veranda of Cray's Folly that afternoon I retain several notable memories. I got into closer touch with my host and hostess without achieving anything like a proper understanding of either of them, and I procured a new viewpoint of Miss Val Beverley. Her repose was misleading. She deliberately subjugated her own vital personality to that of Madame de Stamer. Why, I knew not, unless she felt herself under an obligation to do so. That her blue-grey eyes could be wistful was true enough. They could also be gay. And once I detected in them a look of sadness which dispelled the butterfly illusion belonging to her dainty slenderness, to her mobile lips, to the vagabond curling hair of russet brown. Paul Harley's manner remained absent, but I who knew his mood so well recognized that his abstraction was no longer real. It was a pose, which he often adopted when in reality he was keenly interested in his surroundings. It baffled me, however, as effectively as it baffled others, and whilst at one moment I decided that he was studying Colonel Menendez, in the next I became convinced that Madame de Stamer was the subject upon his mental dissecting table. That he should find in Madame a fascinating problem did not surprise me. She must have afforded tempting study for any psychologist. I could not fathom the nature of the kinship existing between herself and the Spanish colonel, for Madame de Stamer was French to her fingertips. Her expressions, her gestures, her whole outlook on life proclaimed the fashionable Parisienne. She possessed a vigorous masculine intelligence and was the most entertaining companion imaginable. She was daringly outspoken, and it was hard to believe that her gaiety was forced. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, I became more and more convinced that such was the case. I thought that before affliction visited her, Madame de Stamer must have been a vivacious and a beautiful woman. Her vivacity remained, and much of her beauty, so that it was difficult to believe her snow-white hair to be a product of nature. Again and again I found myself regarding it as a powdered coiffure of the Pompadour period, and wondering why Madame wore no patches. That a deep and sympathetic understanding existed between herself and Colonel Menendez was unmistakable. More than once I intercepted glances from the dark eyes of Madame which were lover-like, yet laden with a profound sorrow. She was playing a role, and I was convinced that Harley knew this. It was not merely a courageous fight against affliction on the part of a woman of the world, versed in masking her real self from the prying eyes of society. It was a studied performance, prompted by some deeper motive. She dressed with exquisite taste, and to see her seated there amid her cushions, gesticulating vivaciously, one would never have supposed that she was crippled. My admiration for her momentarily increased, the more so since I could see that she was sincerely fond of Val Beverley, whose every movement she followed with looks of almost motherly affection. This was all the more strange as Madame de Stamer, whose age I supposed lay somewhere on the sunny side of 40, was of a type which expects and wins admiration long after the average woman has ceased to be attractive. One endowed with such a temperament is, as a rule, unreasonably jealous of youth and good looks in another. I could not determine if Madame's attitude were to be ascribed to complacent self-satisfaction or to a nobler motive. It sufficed for me that she took an unfeigned joy in the youthful sweetness of her companion. "Well, dear," she said presently, addressing the girl, "you should make those sleeves shorter, my dear." She had a rapid way of speaking, and possessed a slightly husky but fascinatingly vibrant voice. "Your arms are very pretty. You should not hide them." Val Beverley blushed, and laughed to conceal her embarrassment. "Oh, my dear," exclaimed Madame, "why be ashamed of arms? All women have arms, but some do well to hide them." "Quite right, Marie," agreed the Colonel, his thin voice affording an odd contrast to the deeper tones of his cousin. "But it is the scraggy ones who seem to delight in displaying their angles." "The English, yes," Madame admitted, "but the French, no. They are too clever one." "French women think too much about their looks," said Val Beverley quietly. "Oh, you know they do, Madame. They would rather die than be without admiration." Madame shrugged her shoulders. "So would I, my dear," she confessed. "Although I cannot walk. Without admiration there is—" she snapped her fingers, "nothing. And who would notice a linnet when a bird of paradise was about, however sweet her voice? Tell me that, my dear." Paul Harley aroused himself, and laughed heartily. "Yet," he said, "I think with Miss Beverley that this love of elegance does not always make for happiness. Surely it is the cause of half the domestic tragedies in France." "Ah, the French love elegance," cried Madame, shrugging. "They cannot help it. To secure what is elegant to a Frenchwoman would sometimes forget her husband, yes, but never forget herself." "Really, Marie," protested the Colonel, "you say most strange things." "Is that so, Juan?" she replied, casting one of her queer glances in his direction. "But how would you like to be surrounded by a lot of drabs, eh? That man, Mr. Knox." She extended one white hand in the direction of Colonel Menendez, the fingers half closed, in a gesture which curiously reminded me of Sarah Bernhardt. "That man would notice if a parlour-maid came into the room with a shoe unbuttoned. Poof! If we love elegance, it is because without it the men would never love us." Colonel Menendez bent across the table and kissed the white fingers in his courtier-like fashion. "My sweet cousin," he said, "I should love you in rags." Madame smiled and flushed like a girl, but withdrawing her hand she shrugged. "They would have to be pretty rags," she added. During this little scene I detected Val Beverley looking at me in a vaguely troubled way, and it was easy to guess that she was wondering what construction I should place upon it. However— "I am going into the town," declared Madame de Stamer energetically. "Half the things ordered from Artley's have never been sent." "Oh, Madame, please let me go," cried Val Beverley. "My dear," pronounced Madame, "I will not let you go, but I will let you come with me if you wish." She rang a little bell which stood upon the tea-table beside the urn, and Pedro came out through the drawing-room. "Pedro," she said, "is the car ready?" The Spanish butler bowed. "Tell Carter to bring it round. Hurry, dear," to the girl. "If you are coming with me, I shall not be a minute." Thereupon she whisked her mechanical chair about, waved her hand to dismiss Pedro, and went steering through the drawing-room at a great rate, with Val Beverley walking beside her. As we resumed our seats, Colonel Menendez lay back with half-closed eyes, his glance following the chair and its occupant until both were swallowed up in the shadows of the big drawing-room. "Madame de Stamer is a very remarkable woman," said Paul Harley. "Remarkable?" replied the Colonel. "The spirit of all the old chivalry of France is imprisoned within her, I think." He passed cigarettes around, of a long kind resembling cheroots and wrapped in tobacco leaf. I thought it strange that, having thus emphasized Madame's nationality, he did not feel it incumbent upon him to explain the mystery of their kinship. However, he made no attempt to do so, and almost before we had lighted up, a racy little two-seater was driven around the gravel path by Carter, the chauffeur, who had brought us to Cray's Folly from London. The man descended and began to arrange wraps and cushions, and a few moments later, back came Madame again, dressed for driving. Carter was about to lift her into the car when Colonel Menendez stood up and advanced. "Sit down, Juan, sit down," said Madame sharply. A look of keen anxiety, I had almost said of pain, leapt into her eyes, and the Colonel hesitated. "How often must I tell you," continued the throbbing voice, "that you must not exert yourself?" Colonel Menendez accepted the rebuke humbly, but the incident struck me as grotesque, for it was difficult to associate delicacy with such a fine specimen of well-preserved manhood as the Colonel. However, Carter performed the duty of assisting Madame into her little car, and when for a moment he supported her upright, before placing her among the cushions, I noticed that she was a tall woman, slender and elegant. All smiles and light, sparkling conversation, she settled herself comfortably at the wheel, and Val Beverley got in beside her. Madame nodded to Carter in dismissal, waved her hand to Colonel Menendez, cried au revoir, and then away went the little car, swinging around the angle of the house and out of sight. Our host stood bare-headed upon the veranda, listening to the sound of the engine dying away among the trees. He seemed to be lost in reflection from which he only aroused himself when the purr of the motor became inaudible. "And now, gentlemen," he said, and suppressed a sigh, "we have much to talk about. This spot is cool, but is it sufficiently private? Perhaps, Mr. Harley, you would prefer to talk in the library." Paul Harley flicked ash from the end of his cigarette. "Better still in your own study, Colonel Menendez," he replied. "What, do you suspect eavesdroppers?" asked the Colonel, his manner becoming momentarily agitated. He looked at Harley as though he suspected the latter of possessing private information. "We should neglect no possible precaution," answered my friend. "That agencies inimical to your safety are focused upon the house your own statement amply demonstrates." Colonel Menendez seemed to be on the point of speaking again, but he checked himself, and in silence led the way through the ornate library to a smaller room which opened out of it, and which was furnished as a study. Here the motif was distinctly one of officialdom. Although the southern element was not lacking, it was not so marked as in the library or in the hall. The place was appointed for utility rather than ornament. Everything in perfect order. In the library, with the blinds drawn, one might have supposed oneself in Trinidad. In the study, under similar conditions, one might equally well have imagined Downing Street to lie outside the windows. Essentially, this was the workroom of a man of affairs. Having settled ourselves comfortably, Paul Harley opened the conversation. "In several particulars," said he, "I find my information to be incomplete." He consulted the back of an envelope, upon which, I presume during the afternoon, he had made a number of penciled notes. "For instance," he continued, "your detection of someone watching the house, and subsequently of someone forcing an entrance, had no visible association with the presence of the Batwing attached to your front door?" "No," replied the Colonel slowly. "These episodes took place a month ago." "Exactly a month ago?" "They took place immediately before the last full moon." "Ah, before the full moon. And because you associate the activities of the voodoo with the full moon, you believe that the old menace has again become active?" The Colonel nodded emphatically. He was busily engaged in rolling one of his eternal cigarettes. "This belief of yours was recently confirmed by the discovery of the Batwing?" "I no longer doubted," said Colonel Menendez, shrugging his shoulders. "How could I?" "Quite so," murmured Harley absently, and evidently pursuing some private train of thought. And now I take it that your suspicions, if expressed in words, would amount to this. During your last visit to Cuba, you A. either killed some high priest of voodoo, or B. seriously injured him? Assuming the first theory to be the correct one, your death was determined upon the sect over which he had formerly presided. Assuming the second to be accurate, however, it is presumably the man himself for whom we must look. Now, Colonel Menendez, kindly inform me if you recall the name of this man." "I recall it very well," replied the colonel. "His name was Macombo, and he was a Benin Negro." "Assuming that he is still alive, what, roughly, would his age be today?" The colonel seemed to meditate, pushing a box of long Martinique cigars across the table in my direction. "He would be an old man," he pronounced. "I myself am 52, and I should say that Macombo, if alive today, would be nearer to 70 than 60. "Ah," murmured Harley. "And did he speak English?" "A few words, I believe." Paul Harley fixed his gaze upon the dark, aquiline face. "In short," he said, "do you really suspect that it was Macombo whose shadow you saw upon the lawn, who a month ago made a midnight entrance into Cray's Folly, and who recently pinned a bat-wing to the door?" Colonel Menendez seemed somewhat taken aback by this direct question. "I cannot believe it," he confessed. "Do you believe that this order or religion of voodooism has any existence outside those places where African Negroes or descendants of Negroes are settled?" "I should not have been prepared to believe it, Mr. Harley, prior to my experiences in Washington and elsewhere." "Then you do believe that there are representatives of this cult to be met with in Europe and in America?" "I should have been prepared to believe it possible in America, for in America there are many Negroes, but in England—" Again he shrugged his shoulders. "I would remind you," said Harley quietly, "that there are also quite a number of Negroes in England. If you seriously believe voodoo to follow Negro migration, I can see no objection to assuming it to be a universal cult." "Such an idea is incredible." "Yet by what other hypothesis," asked Harley, "are we to cover the facts of your own case as stated by yourself? Now," he consulted his penciled notes, "there is another point. I gather that these African sorcerers rely largely upon what I may term intimidation. In other words, they claim the power of wishing an enemy to death." He raised his eyes and stared grimly at the colonel. "I should not like to suppose that a man of your courage and culture could subscribe to such a belief." "I do not, sir," declared the colonel warmly. "No Obeah man could ever exercise his will upon me." "Yet, if I may say so," murmured Harley, "your will to live seems to have become somewhat weakened." "What do you mean?" Colonel Menendez stood up, his delicate nostrils dilated. He glared angrily at Harley. "I mean that I perceive a certain resignation in your manner, of which I do not approve." "You do not approve?" said Colonel Menendez softly, and I thought as he stood looking down upon my friend that I had rarely seen a more formidable figure. Paul Harley had roused him unaccountably, and knowing my friend for a master of tact, I knew also that this had been deliberate, although I could not even dimly perceive his object. "I occupy the position of a specialist," Harley continued, "and you occupy that of my patient. Now, you cannot disguise from me that your mental opposition to this danger which threatens has become slackened. Allow me to remind you that the strongest defense is counterattack. You are angry, Colonel Menendez, but I would rather see you angry than apathetic. To come to my last point, you spoke of a neighbor in terms which led me to suppose that you suspected him of some association with your enemies. May I ask the name of this person?" Colonel Menendez sat down again, puffing furiously at his cigarette, whilst beginning to roll another. He was much disturbed, was fighting to regain mastery of himself. "I apologize from the bottom of my heart," he said, "for a breach of good behavior which really was unforgivable. I was angry when I should have been grateful. Much that you have said is true. Because it is true, I despise myself." He flashed a glance at Paul Harley. "Awake," he continued, "I care for no man breathing, black or white. But asleep," he shrugged his shoulders, "it is in sleep that these dealers in unclean things obtain their advantage." "You excite my curiosity," declared Harley. "Listen." Colonel Menendez bent forward, resting his elbows upon his knees. Between the yellow fingers of his left hand he held the newly completed cigarette, whilst he continued to puff vigorously at the old one. "You recollect my speaking of the death of a certain native girl?" Paul Harley nodded. "The real cause of her death was never known, but I obtained evidence to show that on the night after the wing of a bat had been attached to her hut, she wandered out in her sleep and visited the Black Belt. Can you doubt that someone was calling her?" "Calling her?" "Mr. Harley, she was obeying the call of Macumbo." "The call of Macumbo? You refer to some kind of hypnotic suggestions?" "I illustrate," replied the colonel, "to help make clear something which I have to tell you. On the night when the last moon was full, on the night after someone had entered the house, I had retired early to bed. Suddenly I awoke, feeling very cold. I awoke, I say, and where do you suppose I found myself?" "I am all anxiety to hear." "On the point of entering the Tudor garden, you call it Tudor garden, which is visible from the window of your room." "Most extraordinary," murmured Harley. "And you were in your night attire?" "I was." "And what had awakened you?" "An accident. I believe a lucky accident. I had cut my bare foot upon the gravel, and the pain awakened me." "You had no recollection of any dream which had prompted you to go down into the garden?" "None whatever." "Does your room face in that direction?" "It does not. It faces the lake on the south of the house. I had descended to a side door, unbarred it, and walked entirely around the east wing before I awakened." "Your room faces the lake," murmured Harley. "Yes." Their glances met, and in Paul Harley's expression there seemed to be a challenge. "You have not yet told me," he said, "the name of your neighbor." Colonel Menendez lighted his new cigarette. "Mr. Harley," he confessed, "I regret that I ever referred to this suspicion of mine. Indeed, it is hardly a suspicion, it is what I may call a desperate doubt. Do you say that, a desperate doubt?" "I think I follow you," said Harley. "The fact is this. I only know of one person within 10 miles of Cray's Folly who has ever visited Cuba." "Ah." "I have no other scrap of evidence to associate him with my shadowy enemy. This being so, you will pardon me if I ask you to forget that I ever referred to his existence." He spoke the words with a sort of lofty finality, and accompanied them with a gesture of the hands which really left Harley no alternative but to drop the subject. Again their glances met, and it was patent to me that underlying all this conversation was something beyond my ken. What it was that Harley suspected I could not imagine, nor what it was that Colonel Menendez desired to conceal, but tension was in the very air. The Spaniard was on the defensive, and Paul Harley was puzzled, irritated. It was a strange interview, and one which in the light of after events I recognized to possess extraordinary significance. That sixth sense of Harley's was awake, was prompting him, but to what extent he understood its promptings at that hour I do not know, and have never known to this day. Intuitively, I believe, as he sat there staring at Colonel Menendez, he began to perceive the shadow within a shadow which was the secret of Cray's Folly, which was the thing called Batwing, which was the devilish force at the very hour alive and potent in our midst. Chapter 9. Obeah. This conversation in Colonel Menendez's study produced a very unpleasant impression upon my mind. The atmosphere of Cray's Folly seemed to become charged with unrest. Of Madame de Stamer and Miss Beverley I saw nothing up to the time that I retired to dress. Having dressed, I walked into Harley's room, anxious to learn if he had formed any theory to account for the singular business which had brought us to Surrey. Harley had excused himself directly we had left the study, stating that he wished to get to the village post office in time to send a telegram to London. Our host had suggested a messenger, but this, as well as the offer of a car, Harley had declined, saying that the exercise would aid reflection. Nevertheless, I was surprised to find his room empty, for I could not imagine why the sending of a telegram should have detained him so long. Dusk was falling, and viewed from the open window the Tudor garden below looked very beautiful, part of it lying in a sort of purplish shadow, and the rest being mystically lighted as though viewed through a golden veil. To the whole picture a sort of magic quality was added by a speck of high-light which rested upon the face of the old sundial. I thought that here was a fit illustration for a fairy tale. Then I remembered the Colonel's account of how he had awakened in the act of entering this romantic plaisance, and I was touched anew by an unrestfulness, a sense of the uncanny. I observed a book lying upon the dressing-table, and concluding that it was one which Harley had brought with him, I took it up, glancing at the title. It was Negro Magic, and switching on the light, for there was a private electric plant in Cray's Folly, I opened the book at random and began to read. "The religion of the Negro," said this authority, "is emotional, and more often than not associated with beliefs in witchcraft and in the rites known as voodoo, or Obi mysteries. It has been endeavored by some students to show that these are relics of the fetish worship of equatorial Africa, but such a genealogy has never been satisfactorily demonstrated. The cannibalistic rituals, human sacrifices, and obscene ceremonies resembling those of the Black Sabbath of the Middle Ages, reported to prevail in Haiti and other of the islands, and by some among the Negroes of the southern states of America, may be said to rest on doubtful authority. Nevertheless, it is a fact beyond doubt that among the Negroes both of the West Indies and the United States there is a widespread belief in the powers of the Obeah man. A native who believes himself to have come under the spell of such a sorcerer will sink into a kind of decline and sometimes die." At this point I discovered several paragraphs underlined in pencil, and concluding that the underlining had been done by Paul Harley, I read them with particular care. They were as follows: "According to Hesketh J. Bell, the term obeah is most probably derived from the substantive obi, a word used on the east coast of Africa to denote witchcraft, sorcery, and fetishism in general. The etymology of obi has been traced to a very antique source, stretching far back into Egyptian mythology. A serpent in the Egyptian language was called Ob, or Ob. Obion is still the Egyptian name for a serpent. Moses, in the name of God, forbade the Israelites ever to inquire of the demon Ob, which is translated in our Bible charmer or wizard, divinator or sorcerer. The Witch of Endor is called Aub or Ob, translated Pythonissa, and Albois was the name of the basilisk or royal serpent, emblem of the sun and an ancient oracular deity of Africa. A paragraph followed which was doubly underlined, and pursuing my reading I made a discovery which literally caused me to hold my breath. This is what I read. In a recent contribution to the Occult Review, Mr. Colin Camber, the American authority, offered some very curious particulars in support of a theory to show that whereas snakes and scorpions have always been recognized as sacred by voodoo worshippers, the real emblem of their unclean religion is the bat, especially the vampire bat of South America. He pointed out that the symptoms of one dying beneath the spell of an obeah man are closely paralleled in the cases of men and animals who have suffered from nocturnal attacks of blood-sucking bats. I laid the open book down upon the bed. My brain was in a tumult. The several theories, or outlines of theories which hitherto I had entertained, were, by these simple paragraphs, cast into the utmost disorder. I thought of the Colonel's covert references to a neighbor whom he feared, of his guarded statement that the devotees of voodoo were not confined to the West Indies, of the attack upon him in Washington, of the bat wing pinned to the door of Cray's Folly. Incredulously, I thought of my acquaintance of the Lavender Arms, with his bemused expression and his magnificent brow, and a great doubt and wonder grew up in my mind. I became increasingly impatient for the return of Paul Harley. I felt that a clue of the first importance had fallen into my possession, so that when presently, as I walked impatiently up and down the room, the door opened and Harley entered, I greeted him excitedly. "Harley," I cried, "Harley, I have learned a most extraordinary thing." Even as I spoke and looked into the keen, eager face, the expression in Harley's eyes struck me. I recognized that in him, too, intense excitement was pent up. Furthermore, he was in one of his irritable moods, but full of my own discoveries. "I chanced to glance at this book," I continued, "whilst I was waiting for you. You have underlined certain passages." He stared at me queerly. "I discovered the book in my own library after you had gone last night, Knox, and it was then that I marked the passages which struck me as significant." "But Harley," I cried, "the man who was quoted here, Colin Camber, lives in this very neighbourhood." "I know." "What? You know?" "I learned it from Inspector Aylesbury of the County Police half an hour ago." Harley frowned perplexedly. "Then why in heaven's name didn't you tell me?" he exclaimed. "It would have saved me a most disagreeable journey into Market Hilton." "Market Hilton? What? Have you been into the town?" "That is exactly where I have been, Knox. I phoned through to Innes from the village post office after lunch to have the car sent down. There is a convenient garage by the Lavender Arms." "But the Colonel has 3 cars," I exclaimed. "The horse has 4 legs," replied Harley irritably, "but although I have only 2, there are times when I prefer to use them. I am still wondering why you failed to mention this piece of information when you obtained it." "My dear Harley," said I patiently, "how could I possibly be expected to attach any importance to the matter? You must remember that at the time I had never seen this work on Negro sorcery." "No," said Harley, dropping down upon the bed, "that is perfectly true, Knox. I am afraid I have a liver at times, a distinct Indian liver. Excuse me, old man, but to tell you the truth, I feel strangely inclined to pack my bag and leave for London without a moment's delay." "What?" I cried. "Oh, I know you would be sorry to go, Knox," said Harley, smiling, "and so, for many reasons, should I. But I have the strongest possible objection to being trifled with." "I am afraid I don't quite understand you, Harley." "Well, just consider the matter for the moment. Do you suppose that Colonel Menendez is ignorant of the fact that his nearest neighbour is a recognized authority upon voodoo and allied subjects? You are speaking, of course, of Colin Camber. Of none other." "No," I replied thoughtfully. "The Colonel must know, of course, that Camber resides in the neighbourhood." "And that he knows something of the nature of Camber's studies his remarks sufficiently indicate," added Harley. "The whole theory to account for these attacks upon his life rests on the premise that agents of these Obeah people are established in England and America. Then, in spite of my direct questions, he leaves me to find out for myself that Colin Camber's property practically adjoins his own." "Really? Does he reside so near as that?" "My dear fellow," cried Harley, "he lives at a place called the Guest House. You can see it from part of the grounds of Cray's Folly. We were looking at it today." "What? The house on the hillside?" "That's the Guest House. What do you make of it, Knox? That Menendez suspects this man is beyond doubt. Why should he hesitate to mention his name?" "Well," I replied slowly, "probably because to associate practical sorcery and assassination with such a character would be preposterous. But the man is admittedly a student of these things, Knox." "He may be, and that he is a genius of some kind I am quite prepared to believe. But having had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Colin Camber, I am not prepared to believe him capable of murder." I suppose I spoke with a certain air of triumph, for Paul Harley regarded me silently for a while. "You seem to be taking this case out of my hands, Knox," he said. Whilst I have been systematically at work racing about the county in quest of information, you would appear to have blundered further into the labyrinth than all my industry has enabled me to do." He remained in a very evil humour, and now the cause of this suddenly came to light. "I have spent a thoroughly unpleasant afternoon," he continued, "interviewing an impossible country policeman who had never heard of my existence." This display of human resentment honestly delighted me. It was refreshing to know that the omniscient Paul Harley was capable of pique. "One Inspector Aylesbury," he went on bitterly, "a large person, bearing a really interesting resemblance to a walrus, but lacking that creature's intelligence. It was not until Superintendent East had spoken to him from Scotland Yard that he ceased to treat me as a suspect. But his new attitude was almost more provoking than the old one. He adopted the manner of a regimental sergeant-major reluctantly interviewing a private with a grievance. If matters should so develop that we are compelled to deal with that fish-faced idiot, God help us all." He burst out laughing, his good humour suddenly quite restored, and taking out his pipe began industriously to load it. "I can smoke while I'm changing," he said, "and you can sit there and tell me all about Colin Camber." I did as he requested, and Harley, who could change quicker than any man I had ever known, had just finished tying his bow as I completed my story of the encounter at the Lavender Arms. He muttered as I ceased speaking. "At every turn I realize that without you I should have been lost, Knox. I am afraid I shall have to change your duties tomorrow." "Change my duties? What do you mean?" "I warn you that the new ones will be less pleasant than the old. In other words, I must ask you to tear yourself away from Miss Val Beverley for an hour in the morning and take advantage of Mr. Camber's invitation to call upon him. Frankly, I doubt if he would acknowledge me. Nevertheless, you have a better excuse than I. In the circumstances, it is most important that we should get in touch with this man." "Very well," I said ruefully. "I will do my best. But you don't seriously think, Harley, that the danger comes from there?" Paul Harley took his dinner jacket from the chair upon which the man had laid it out, and turned to me. "My dear Knox," he said, "you may remember that I spoke recently of retiring from this profession?" "You did?" "My retirement will not be voluntary, Knox. I shall be kicked out as an incompetent ass. For, respecting the connection, if any, between the narrative of Colonel Menendez, the bat-wing nailed to the door of the house, and Mr. Colin Camber, I have not the foggiest notion. In this, at last, I have triumphed over Auguste Dupin. Auguste Dupin never confessed defeat. End of Part 3.